This the occult.
Beatles.
Hello, I'm Matt Sergiou, the proprietor of the website The Occult Beatles, and back in October of last year, 2024, I recorded a conversation with Joe Robinson, author of the book The Beatles and Their Journey into Beatledom. I'll leave Joe to describe some of the aspects and the overall theme of what it's about, how it goes about examining the history of the Beatles and what the band means to him, and his take on how the band impacted on the world back in the 1960s. But I will say here, just so that you know some of what to expect during my conversation with Joe in just a few minutes, in his book, he dives into the Beatles' lyrics, finding within them phrases that he finds to be attuned to the principles of quantum mechanics. That you might find to be rather unexpected when thinking of the Beatles, perhaps. He also digs into some of the more recognisable when one thinks of the group, such as their groundbreaking journeys into the Vedic. Joe and I discuss and make mention of many of the milestones that one passes when taking a journey into Beatledom, from the band's teenage days in Liverpool, when John Lennon and Paul McCartney first met at the Walton Village Fete, where John was playing with his band The Quarrymen, named after his old school, the Quarry Bank Grammar School, through to the Beatles' pre-Fame and pre-Ringo days, recording with musician Tony Sheridan and gigging in the clubs of Hamburg and at Liverpool's Cavern Club in Matthew Street, the club which helped give rise to the so-called Merseybeat movement, a label which has been used to describe the proliferation of Liverpool bands during the late 50s, early 60s who were creating their own scene, their own sound, independent of what was going on elsewhere in Britain. And then, beyond Liverpool, the Beatles taking on the world and winning with a little help from their friends, including their trusted PR man Derek Taylor, their record producer George Martin, their avant-garde contact and communicator Barry Miles and his Indica bookshop in London, which he co-ran with his business partner Peter Asher, brother of actress Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend during most of the 1960s, of course. And then there's old Hamburg friends such as Jürgen Vollmer, who persuaded the Beatles to adopt that mop-top hairstyle of theirs, considered outrageously long at the time, but revolutionary too. All these people are mentioned and more as Joe and I weave in and out of themes mentioned in his book, including the Beatles' relationship with LSD, John's controversial comments in an interview in 1966 that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ, and subjects of a much more esoteric vein, including John's alleged pact with the devil, possible nods towards sun symbolism, Liverpool's Neolithic stones, underground tunnels and references to druids, as well as the possibility that the Beatles, as far back as their pre-fame days in Liverpool, were attuned to the occult and esoterica. Joe was born and bred in Liverpool, and as a youngster he passed the relevant test that gained him a place at grammar school, same as John, Paul and George. He's old enough to remember seeing the Beatles perform as a working band. He remembers his first memory of seeing them on British TV on the ITV network on the channel Granada. And as you'll hear him say in my chat with him, Joe is closely connected to the Beatles' Liverpool network of old, including Bob Wooler, who was DJ at the Cavern Club back when the Beatles were there and was in many respects, and I think Joe would probably agree with this, a mentor figure to the band before they made it big. Originally published in 2015 as Journey into Beatledom and since retitled The Beatles and Their Journey into Beatledom, as I said earlier, Joe explores quantum mechanics and Hinduism, avenues of exploration that some might deem to be esoteric. Also, he makes mention of well-trodden, quote-unquote, conspiracy theories, such as Paul is dead. But that's not the main thrust of the book. That's not what drives it.
I wouldn't say there are any conspiracy theories in it, but there are. It's a reading, it's an interpretation based upon what I call, in terms of the songs, in terms of what I call reader response theory or fan response. So in other words, it's an analysis of the effect of the Beatlemania on their songs and on the fans.
We're going to get into the quantum aspect of it very shortly. Yeah. That's one of the questions I'd like to ask you. But before we get into any of that, into the really deep stuff, right. Tell me a bit about yourself.
Right. I was born in Liverpool in 1955. So when the Beatles hit fame, I was 7, 8 years old, so I was only a kid. But I just remember them coming on TV in '62 before they were famous. It was late '62. And I was with my mum and dad watching it, black and white TV. It was on Granada TV, ITV. And these four guys came on. I'd never heard of them. I'd never heard of them because I was too young to go to the Cavern. I went to the Cavern, though, the original Cavern, before it closed years later. And I remember my dad saying the state of the long hair on them, and they'll never make it with long hair like that. And me and my mum thought they were great. And I've been smitten by them ever since. And then, obviously, growing up as a grammar school boy, I was reasonably well educated. I did my first degree in community studies because I was a community worker and manager looking after people with learning difficulties, and then I did a master's degree in English literature, what's called the history of ideas and philosophy, and then I became a teacher for 25 years, and I retired a few years ago.
And you have some personal associations or relationships with some of the Beatles' old associates from their Liverpool days. I think Alan Williams, who is classed as their first ever manager back in Liverpool in their pre-fame days. Also Bob Wooler as well, who was the DJ at the Cavern Club. Got that right?
Yeah. I knew Bob Wooler a lot better than Alan. Funnily enough, when I used to come home from work down in the Dingle, Liverpool 8 near Toxteth, I'd get on the bus because I don't drive it, and Alan Williams would be sitting on the seat, and he'd be going into town every day for a drink. He liked to drink, and so did Bob. And the two of them were like the terrible twins, really. They were always in town, and they would always tell stories. And Bob was a stickler for the truth, and Alan would tell you stories because he wanted to make you laugh. A little bit like the Beatles in a way, you know what I mean? They were sticklers for the truth, but they also wanted to make you laugh. And so I got to know Bob, and I helped Bob with his autobiography. But unfortunately, before he died, he wouldn't put it out for a whole host of personal reasons. And it ended up with the BBC Spencer Lee taking his and my manuscript and putting that out. And that's how I got to know Spencer, because when he realised I'd been involved with it, he started invite me onto his shows, and I got to know Mark Lewis and a little bit, Alan, some of the Merseybeat people. And I had a close friend called John Seddon, who unfortunately is no longer with us, and he was a business partner of Ringo Starr. So sort of got involved that way,
I've come across the name of Spencer Lee. Obviously, I've come across, me being a huge Beatles fan since pretty much I was born 50 odd years ago. I've obviously, it goes with the territory that I'm going to know who Mark Lewison is, regarded as one of the best, if not the best, Beatles historian, mainstream Beatles historian.
Without doubt, yeah.
Without doubt, that's what he's regarded as. And also Spencer Lee, I have come across the name of Spencer Lee. Does he present a BBC radio show, or he used to present a BBC radio show? Yeah, he did
it for many, many years. I mean, I think he used to go to the Cavern when the Beatles were there. He was born in 1945. He'd written lots of books, not just about the Beatles, but about lots of rock stars. I think he holds the world record for the number of musicians he's actually interviewed. He's interviewed thousands. He knows, obviously, he knows a lot about the Beatles. His knowledge of music is immense. It's immense. I mean, I know a lot about the Beatles, but not a lot about much else in music. I'll be perfectly honest. His breadth of knowledge is immense.
Okay, but with regards to your book, an overarching theme, I think you've already mentioned it, if my memory serves me correctly in passing, is connecting the Beatles to quantum physics, that we can hear it and read it in the lyrics of their songs. And I'd like to get into that. But before I do that, sorry to throw this on you, Joe, but what is quantum physics? In a roundabout layman's term, I know it's a huge subject.
Oh my God!
I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Is there a way of summarising it?
Yeah, well, no, the thing is, see, when the Beatles refer to quantum physics in their songs, they're doing it not in a light-hearted way, but in a sort of an ephemeral way. In other words, they were picking up bits of information from everywhere and thought, oh, that's a good idea, and we'll put that in, because obviously they were fantastic songwriters, John and Paul especially early on, so they weren't exploring quantum physics in any deep sense, but basically my knowledge of it, I mean, I'm not a scientist,
Yeah,
I'm a wordsmith, I would say. And my understanding of it is that in terms of reality, reality is popping in and out of existence every nanosecond from a particle to a wave. And the way they explain it, quantum mechanics, in terms of that process, is called superposition, and it's sort of counterintuitive. In other words, it doesn't really make sense when you look at it logically, but people cleverer than me tell me that it does make sense. So that's as far as I would go with it, really. But the fact that the Beatles, even from a very early stage, to be honest, were referencing some of these things in their songs was because they were interested in those kinds of ideas. So this is pre Vedic stuff, Indian stuff, because Vedic philosophy is actually the underpinning foundation of quantum mechanics. They actually, the quantum physicists nicked their idea from Indian Vedic philosophy. That's where they got the idea from.
but you're saying that the Beatles were tapping into this idea, whether consciously or unconsciously,
Yeah.
before, let's say, 1966, 67, when they started to get into the Indian mysticism, for a want of a better term, with the Maharishi and
Yeah,
so on. They were doing it in their early career, from their mop top
yeah,
days.
in a very subtle way.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say that they were, obviously they were musicians, they were songwriters, they wanted money and fame, especially, John Lennon said, I want to be rich, but when they were writing songs, if they, and especially Paul McCartney a bit later on, because, I always say in the book that the Paul was the avant-garde Beatle to begin with, not John. But obviously, once he met Yoko, that all changed. And Lennon was obviously an extremely clever, witty, acerbic guy, And I've met people who knew him, and they said he could be fantastic one minute and then a little bit off with you the next. But that's just the way he was. Whereas Paul was more interested in getting the Beatles famous, and so he would be a bit more subtle and a bit more charming.
yeah.
But certainly, obviously, McCartney was extremely clever guy as well. And George Harrison was nobody's fool. And Ringo was very down to earth and funny. And without being educated, was quite clever too. Ringo was a clever guy. He wasn't stupid. He just didn't write songs. He was a great drummer.
I think it was Mark Lewison. I might be wrong, but I seem to recall, from the many Beatles books I've read, and maybe that's the reason I can't remember completely, is because my mind is a tangle of different books and I haven't got them catalogued in my head like a filing system. But I seem to remember,
Same here, to be honest.
yeah, it gets a bit foggy sometimes. But I seem to recall it might have been Mark Lewison who said that part of John Lennon's reading, because he was a voracious reader, John Lennon,
Yeah.
and one of the books that he read as a youngster was Aldous Huxley. He was into Aldous Huxley, and
He did. Yeah.
So
He was into, I mean, I was into Huxley years ago myself, because I studied him. But he was into Huxley in a big way. And he was into the idea of perception, what is perception? What is reality? Before he wrote Strawberry Fields Forever, because in 1963, he writes, there's a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind. And there's no time when I'm alone. Well, that's quite philosophical for 63 in a supposed pop song.
yeah.
Yeah.
And this is long before the days when they were said to be intellectual, when they were, mixing with the Maharishi and so on, and all the other various avant-gardists.
I mean, to be honest with you as well, my book is definitely a reading. It's it's a post hoc interpretation of Beatles songs, but it's based upon my own experience of people in Liverpool who knew them. and it's also based. Other aspects of it are based on first-hand sources and primary historical sources. So there's definitely some truth to it, and the idea that the Beatles were seeking the truth. Well, I think most artists really are when they're creating something, they're looking to see what the truth is. And the Beatles were no different in that respect, but obviously did it very successfully because even today, I mean, in 2020, the year of the pandemic, the two top selling artists in the world were Eminem and the Beatles. And that's according to Forbes magazine,
Cool.
the financial
Wow, it's
magazine.
quite a difference in style there, in music style.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And with regards to Huxley, John Lennon also in an interview called him the governor or one of the governors.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got a quote here, which I took from a quantum physics documentary, because I tried to brush myself up on what quantum physics is, which you just can't do. It's what is quantum physics. We'd be here forever discussing that. But here's a quote, okay, from a documentary about superposition, which is an element of it. A core concept of quantum physics refers to how a particle can exist in multiple states at the same time. So basically from that, what I gather is it can exist on this planet and it can also exist on the moon at the same time. How does that happen? It's like, So in that regard, I'd like to look through some of the lyrics that you've, you look through all the lyrics of the Beatles songs in your book, but there's a few I've pinpointed with regards to quantums, and one of those is "Here, There, and Everywhere" from the Beatles' 1966 album Revolver, because that goes into superposition, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
So can you? Yeah, I mean, I've got lyrics actually here.
See the thing.
Shall I just read out the lyrics?
That was one of McCartney's favourite songs.
Yeah.
Right.
Shall I just read the lyrics out so we can get?
Absolutely.
I won't read them all, but and I won't sing them. To lead a better life, I need my love to be here, making each day of the year, changing my life with a wave of her hand. Nobody can deny that there's something there, running my hands through her hair. Both of us thinking how good it can be. Someone is speaking, but she doesn't know he's there. I want her everywhere. And if she's beside me, I know I need never care. But to love her is to need her everywhere, knowing that love is to share. And just skimming through the lines here.
Yeah. And here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah. I will be there and everywhere, here, there, and everywhere. Yeah.
Well, it's a love song to Jane Asher, but there's definitely little subtle sort of there's a manifestation within that song of otherness, and what is otherness? What is the fact that I mean, in terms of time, and John Lennon and Paul talk about time in the songs. In terms of time, the potentialities outside time are popping in and out of existence every nanosecond, and we're not sure whether what happens next should have happened next or should it have been something else. Those potentialities are wave-like, and what actually happens, in other words, in a particular or particulate circumstances, is what actually does happen. So. Those aspects to it as well. I mean, I do reference some questionable Beatles conspiracy theories or stories in the book Journey into Beatledom, like Lennon selling his soul to the devil in Liverpool in the 60s, the occultist wizard Bazira, Lennon tale from the mid-50s. Obviously, Paul is dead. Ringo replaced on drums by American groove drummer Bernard Purdie. John and Paul's supposed early involvement in MK Ultra psyops programs through Tavistock and the academic musicologist Theodora Dutt. So I'm well aware that some Beatles fans might see my Beatles quantum theory stuff in a similar light, but it's based upon pretty compelling evidence, even though it may also be seen as, like I said, a post hoc deep dive into the songs. And it is an interpretation, and maybe some fans see it like that, and I'm completely okay with that. Because it's part of the mania. it's part of 21st century Beatlemania. What I've written, because I'm a fan, aren't I? I'm a fan. Getting back to the truth, what I was going to say is Beatles manager Brian Epstein's ghostwriter Derek Taylor, who's from Merseyside, very clever man, Derek. He said in Epstein's Cellar Full of Noise, Brian never pulled one stunt to publicise any of his artists, and the Beatles didn't want any of that pretense or artificial nonsense. The overnight cancellation of something called Publicity Inc., which was going to be a pre-famed Beatles marketing tool through the Daily Mirror's Bill Marshall before the Beatles made it, meant that the Fab Four would be like no one else in show business or music at that time. They had their own sound, their own songs, their own style and look, their own personalities, challenging the way things were done by doing things their own way, honestly, as themselves. So honesty and truth were key. And when I was looking at all this stuff, that was my focus, was saying, is this actually true? And if it's not true, it still feeds into the mania. So, like the Paul is dead thing, it may not be true, but it certainly affected the way the Beatles wrote the songs, because John Lennon actually said, we started playing around with songs because we realised that the fans were thinking about us in ways that weren't actually true, but it didn't really matter because it just helped us to write songs anyway.
You mentioned a cellar full of noise there. Just something I wanted to pick up on. Brian Epstein was a trailblazer in terms of being a pop music manager. No one had come along who had managed a band or a group or a singer in the way that he managed the Beatles. He was a pioneer. It was the early days of pop music, the music business.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would take issue with some of what Derek states in that book. I mean, it is an official biography, and for example, to say that some of the Beatles' fame wasn't engineered, that there is a claim for a start that I think it might have been Brian Epstein's assistant or his manager, Alistair Taylor, who comes from Liverpool, who says that the first single, the official first Beatles single, Love Me Do, that it was pumped up the charts. That's the claim, that it was pumped up the charts because basically what Brian did is he bought he bought thousands of copies of it for his record shop in Liverpool so that he could bump it up the charts. Now, this is a claim that was actually put forward by Alistair Taylor, wasn't it? Although it's been denied by others.
I remember reading that. Yeah. All I'd say about that is, from my point of view, because obviously, I wasn't there, you wasn't there. Well, what I would say is that Epstein was a professional businessman when it come to his shop, and he bought those records because he wanted to sell them. He wanted to sell them. He didn't want them left on a shelf, and there were, Beatles were number one in Liverpool on the local chart, and the Liverpool music scene was completely different from the rest of the UK, because it was a port and had strong links to America, and copies of records were coming into Liverpool and being played on record tables which wouldn't have been available elsewhere. So Liverpool had its own sort of music scene, and the bands were and the Beatles were listening to stuff that other people hadn't heard, B-sides and stuff like that. And the story that Alistair Taylor tells that the guy that was it Raymond Jones was supposed to have come into the shop and to buy that single and ask for it. And that Raymond Jones didn't exist. When I spoke to Bob Wooler about it, because Bob knew Brian Epstein really well, Bob told me that Raymond Jones did exist and does exist, and that he did come in. So, who do you believe?
Yeah,
and Bob was a stickler for the truth, because I don't know whether you know this, but Bob actually wasn't that. Bob was a songwriter. He wrote a song with George Martin. Bob Wooler wrote a song with George Martin in the early 60s.
No, I didn't know that.
It didn't do much, but and Bob was very erudite and very well read, and but he liked Tin Pan Alley and Denmark Street stuff. And he wasn't that impressed with a lot of the Beatles stuff, even though he thought they were a great live band. He thought they were absolutely atmospheric and in fact, he said that they exploded on a jaded scene because the Merseybeat scene, it wasn't called Merseybeat then, but the Merseybeat scene was starting to fade a little bit. And when they come back from Hamburg, he said they exploded and it reignited it. So he loved them. Bob, as did Brian Epstein, he loved the Beatles. He was in love with them, to be honest with you. And Bob said that he wasn't that impressed because Bob liked old-fashioned proper rhyming schemes, Tin Pan Alley stuff where the songs are witty and actually rhyme. And obviously, even the Beatles, a lot of their rhymes aren't true rhymes, Yeah. I mean, very brilliant stuff, but still. So, I mean, Bob loved songs like She Loves You because he turned around and said, She Loves You comes in, introduces itself, is very pacey, very exhilarating. He said, and then it F's off. That's what he said, which is what a pop song should do. And Bob wasn't one for swearing, he didn't F and blind, Bob was quite posh, really. But he didn't like The Long and Winding Road. He didn't like I Am the Walrus, which is one of my favourite Beatles songs. And he was a stickler for the truth. And when he said that Raymond Jones existed and came in and bought that single, I actually believe Bob, to be honest.
Yeah, that single was actually My Bonnie, wasn't it? Which was one of the songs that the Beatles recorded in Hamburg before they got signed to EMI, sort of in their pre-fame days. Yeah, and the story is that Brian Epstein had never heard of the Beatles up until that point, and it wasn't until Raymond came in and there seemed to be this interest from other people that were coming into the shop for this unknown band that had recorded this song in Hamburg. So that set Brian off onto this search to find out who are this band that everyone is asking about. Even Mark Lewison has argued against that claim, though, as well, hasn't he? He says, well, it's quite impossible to believe, according to Mark Lewison, that Brian wouldn't have heard of the Beatles when My Bonnie was around, and that he needed this Raymond guy to let him to.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there's a bit of publicity management going on there by Epstein. I mean, he'd not seen the Beatles. Yeah, he'd seen them. He'd not seen them perform. He'd seen them in the shop, though.
Yeah, and
they were always hanging around the shop.
I think Mark Lewison also said. Mark Lewison also said that. He must have known about them because they both appeared in the local music magazine Merseybeat. So Brian Epstein was writing record reviews for the magazine.
I think that's.
And if you turned over the next page, and Brian Mark Lewison assumes would have been reading this magazine, it would have only taken Brian to turn over the page to see that the Beatles would have been on the next page after his review. They would have been there in front of him, so he would have been aware of them. So there is.
He was definitely aware of them, without a doubt. Yeah, because there was a tea room coffee shop right opposite his Nems store in Whitechapel, next door to where they used to buy all the guitars. And in the afternoon, when they'd finished their Cavern afternoon slot, they'd go in there for a cup of tea, or a cup of coffee, and a ciggy. And Brian Epstein. Shop was right opposite, so they'd pop in the shop to listen to records and catch. John Lennon was always catching cigarettes off people because he was always skint, and they'd hang around all afternoon. You know what I mean? Because they'd be playing in the evening, so it wasn't even worth going home half the time. And that's what it was like. I mean, it would have been lovely. I was too young, but I was always in town with my mother at that age. But up in London Road, which is a bit further out, it would have been lovely to bump into them. You know what I mean? Yeah. I was going to say, though, you were talking about this political stuff before, and in terms of what's relevant today, and especially with what's going on in the world today, this very day, in terms of peace and love, or lack of peace and love. I mean, the Beatles were prophets. They were peaceniks. They were not just entertainers or musicians, but they also came over as, maybe unintended at times, social and political commentators, and some of their songs were philosophical in tone. I mean, Ian MacDonald, when Revolution Ed called them unacknowledged legislators of populist revolt.
Yeah.
You
I'd
know,
like.
their songs often dealt with the themes of peace and love and understanding, but also the idea of perception and its connections to time, the interconnections of the mundane, that is the solid particulate in terms of quantum aspects of the everyday, and then the wave-like nature of the surreal, what Lennon a little bit later called the in-out problem. And he mentions in Revolution, doesn't he? Don't you know that you can count me out, in, out? And what he's saying there, you know, do you solve the world's problems by being a pacifist, or do you have to get stuck in and sometimes fight for what you want?
Yeah.
And that's what, and basically, that's the same problem. I think why the Beatles are still relevant, not just their music, because the music's fantastic, but in terms of their messages, the reason why they're still relevant is because that message is just as relevant today as it ever was, you know?
And I'd like to get into a little bit more of what you've just said there with regards to some of their lyrics.
Yeah.
But before I get into there's a couple actually, or one that I'm looking at on my list here that I've typed out, Strawberry Fields Forever, which gets
Oh, yeah.
into that aspect of what you're talking about. But before I go into that one, I'd like to get your thoughts on Across the Universe, because again, it's got this quantum feel
Yeah.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, I was only thinking about that yesterday. You know, the thing is with Across the Universe is, was it Einstein who talked about spooky action at a distance?
Yes, it was.
When
Yeah.
yeah, and there are aspects of that in Across the Universe. There are aspects of even unintended. Maybe they didn't intend it, but it doesn't mean that see, in terms of literary theory, there's different theories out there that it's not just the intention of the writer, but it's the way that people interpret whatever's written, which can be just as valid, you know, because and I think whether the Beatles intended some of these things or not, they were there. And if fans pick up on that, like me, that's part of the mania, and it affects the overall output, I think, because the mania they were in this bubble, and they were absolutely affected by it. They were affected by, and it affected the songwriting because it's a loop. See, it's like almost like biofeedback in a way, you know.
Yeah. Words are flowing out like endless. What is it? Oh God, the lyrics
Rain
have gone.
into a paper cup. They slither while they pass, they slip away across the universe.
Yeah.
Thoughts meander like a restless wind inside a letterbox, tumbling blindly as they make their way across the universe. Yeah.
Yeah. This is what John said about the song, and again, it's debatable whether they were conscious of quantums when they were writing these songs, when John and Paul and George were writing these songs or not. But this is what John said, and I think this, if you haven't heard this quote before, it might sort of give you some kind of answer if you have any questions. He said, I was lying next to my first wife, Cynthia, in bed, you know, and I was
Yeah.
irritated.
Yeah.
She must have been going on and on about something, and she'd gone to sleep, and I kept hearing these words over and over, flowing like an endless stream. So I went downstairs, and it turned into a sort of a cosmic song rather than an irritated song, rather than a why are you always mouthing off at me or whatever, right? But the words stand luckily by themselves. They were purely inspirational and were given to me as boom. I don't own it, you know? It came through like that. I don't know where it came from. It's not a matter of craftsmanship. It wrote itself. It drove me out of bed.
Yeah.
I didn't want to write it. I was just slightly irritable, and I went downstairs and I couldn't get to sleep until I put it on paper, and then I went to sleep. It's like being possessed.
Yeah.
Like a psychic or a medium. The thing has to go down. It won't let you sleep. So you have to get up, make it into something, and then you're allowed to sleep. That's always in the middle of the bloody night when you're half awake or tired and your critical facilities are switched on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think creativity is a quantum thing. I really do. I think it's popping in and out of existence, and it happens with me sometimes. I'm sure it happens with you. I mean, I listen to some of your podcasts, and I have to say, you yourself are a very good communicator. It was very interesting, some of the things that you said, and that's why I agreed to do this, because I thought this guy knows his stuff.
Oh wow. Thank you very much.
You know. That's okay. What I'd say about all of that is the Beatles wrote about the nature of perception and reality. They also wrote about the interconnections, comparisons, and contrast between the solid, particulate, mundane and the wave-like, surreal, the issue of the mind, time, and quantumness, and therefore the interconnectedness of everything. And they referred implicitly and sometimes explicitly to quantum physics and, of course, Vedic philosophies and beliefs, which are, of course, forerunners of theories about quantum mechanics, as we see in a number of the songs. Songs which, I'll go into detail now. There's a place, as I've mentioned, which is in 63. The lyric from There's a Place Where I Can Go and It's My Mind and There's No Time When I'm Alone. Eleanor Rigby and She's Leaving Home are juxtapositions of the mundane and the surreal, here, there and everywhere, as we spoke about. Strawberry Fields Forever, Nothing is Real, which Niles Bohr, when he was asked about what is quantum mechanics, he said, well, in an epithet, I'd say nothing is real. And the process of superposition can be described as here, there and everywhere. Penny Lane with the hourglass and the wintry summer, what they call it, a deus ex machina. It's like a sort of, tool to compare different, because it comes over as a summery song, but part of it is set in autumn and winter. Penny Lane. Tomorrow Never Knows, which was originally called The Void. Mm-hmm. That other place. And Ringo came up with that title. And the actual title Tomorrow Never Knows is very futurist, isn't it? It's about the future. It's about time. Fool on the Hill. And in actual fact, when McCartney wrote Fool on the Hill, he was referring to two people, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and a guy called Buckminster Fuller, who invented the idea of buckyballs, which are the largest quantum entity that can exist, the carbon atoms. And Buckminster Fuller was John sent him a copy of the White Album. Paul McCartney had some of his geodesic domes in his garden. So the Beatles knew about these guys, and Buckminster Fuller talks about quantum mechanics. He's an architect. He's a futurist. And the Beatles knew about this stuff, certainly from the mid-60s, because, like you said, John was very well read and Paul was involved with Barry Miles and all those people at the Indica Gallery. So they were picking up ideas all the time, and George was into this Vedism. So that's part of it as well. And it's funny now, in terms of what I call the eternal flux that the Beatles were involved in. There was always something going on within their lives, because and their creativity was, and their relationships with each other were always changing. They were competing with each other and supporting each other at the same time. So that's popping in and out as well, isn't it? Yeah. I do think that, they were at the center of this storm, which they tried their best to control, and it was impossible to control. So there's definitely some form of eternal flux going on there. And in the 21st century on Spotify now, the flux is evident now, because the most popular song on Spotify is Here Comes the Sun, which is a Harrison song.
Yeah. And with regards to that dome that you mentioned, Buckminster Fuller and the dome, there's, as you say, I actually wrote an article where I mentioned this dome that's in the back garden of McCartney's house in St. John's Wood, which is not that far away from Abbey Road Studios. It's called a meditation dome, isn't it? He's built this glass. He has this glass dome in his garden. So are you saying that was basically based or inspired by Buckminster Fuller, who I also understand designed a prototype for the first ever car that could fly and swim and drive on the road. It never got built, of course, but it was that dome actually based on Buckminster Fuller, or was it just one of those coincidences?
No, I think it was based on Buckminster Fuller, because you're supposed to sit below it, and it affects your mind and your chakras, isn't it? It's supposed to affect your chakras. So I think.
Did Buckminster Fuller build those domes to be homes? Weren't they prototypes of what he wanted?
I think you're right.
You also mentioned Niles Bohr the Danish physicist, one of the early pioneers of quantum science back in the 20th century. I've got one of his quotes here. Everything that we call real is made out of things that cannot be regarded as real.
Yeah. There you go. I mean, Lennon was so well read, and he was reading Tibetan stuff as well, which says similar things. You know what I mean? These religious philosophies say similar things about reality and where reality comes from, and what we actually see, how it's affected by things which we can't see.
And that kind of has a connection to Fall on the Hill, because you say that McCartney wrote that partly because of the Maharishi, who was the Beatles' so-called Indian guru. What McCartney was basically saying in this song, I think I've read quotes of him talking about it, is what he meant by Maharishi being a fool was the way that the mainstream world regarded the Maharishi back in the 60s, when back then Indian philosophies and mysticism, so-called mysticism, was a new thing in the West, in the so-called West. So people were looking at the Maharishi's theories as a bit, sort of woo-woo, and he was being regarded as a bit of a clown. And it didn't help that the Maharishi used to giggle a lot in sort of interviews.
He did.
So that was, but that kind of touches on the Vedic, doesn't it? Fall on the Hill. The fact that McCartney is mentioning the Maharishi, although not by name in the song, there's a Vedic connection there, because it's the Maharishi is being mentioned, it's being referred to. So you get that Vedic connection in that song as well, don't you?
Well, Buckminster Fuller and the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi were friends. I mean, Fuller's considered to be a genius. He was the second world president of Mensa. But he also felt that his mental, intellectual faculties could be developed and shared with everyone else. He was a strong advocate of personal development, and it was this human philosophy that created a strong bond between him and the Mahesh Yogi, obviously the founder of transcendental meditation technique. As I've said, both could be considered the fool on the hill, the giggling aspect, as you just mentioned, and Fuller was crazy ideas. Well, I mean, the elites thought that, Fuller was a bit beyond it, He saw reality as... See, that's another thing about Buckminster Fuller. He saw reality as a matter of tuning in and out rather than the three dimensions of space and the fourth dimension of time. And it's interesting that Mark Lewison calls the first of his part of his trilogy Tune In.
Yeah, he's
because John Lennon said, "Don't you know that you can count me out in?"
Yeah,
and it's that thing again, about tuning in and out of reality. And Buckminster Fuller goes on about that an awful lot. In fact, there's an interview with him on YouTube where he actually talks about he thinks that reality is based upon just two aspects, a bit like tuning into a radio and out of a radio, like Radio Caroline and Radio Luxembourg, the way you used to lose the frequency. He talks about that, and there's another guy as well. I mean, Maxwell Silverhammer, when McCartney's talking about that, and he'd been to the, he'd been reading all these books through his intellectual friends in London. He's referring to James Clerk Maxwell, whose electromagnetic theories of light and colour were a forerunner of quantum theory. And of course, then there's the inventor Thomas Edison, who's also mentioned in the song, and he's another scientist who laid out similar groundwork. So you can see that both McCartney and Lennon wrote about these fringe avant-garde and scientific ideas in their songs, and Harrison too obviously wrote about Vedism.
Yeah.
And the interconnectedness of all things and what's being called the non-dualistic nature of reality. So
Maxwell's Silverhammer, of course, which is from the Abbey Road album. And it was Newton's The Light Bulb. It was his invention of the light bulb that sparked off, no pun intended, the debate into quantum physics. People looking at how light works and the color of light, and that's what started it all off. I
mean, I think why it's all relevant today as well is because, Buckminster Fuller and others said 50 years ago, many people thought mankind as a whole, and not just the elite, were going to change the world. One of the popular aphorisms of the day was, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. There were many who believed they knew what the solution was. The solution was all you need is love. And that everyone was part of it. But as it turned out, something was missing. And just when the revolutionary fervour of the counterculture began to slip away in 1968, it was another Beatles lyric that suggested the reason it was in the song Revolution on their 68 White album. You say you want a revolution, well, we all want to change the world. You say you got a real solution, well, we'd all love to see the plan. It's the plan that what was missing then and is still missing today. Where is the long-term plan? How precisely do we go about changing the world? What does the changing the world actually mean? And as Tina Turner said, what's love got to do with it? What's love got to do with it? You need a plan. In the absence of a plan and in response to the Beatles' Peace, Love manifesto, the plan is to offer one. It was what Buckminster Fuller called the Whole Earth Design Project. He was a futurist, and many of his designs and inventions, including the geometrically strong of what they call omni-triangulated geodesic dome, where the structures of it supported each other, recognized that we're all passengers and crew members above spaceship Earth, architectural and human interconnectedness on a universal level.
With regards to Buckminster, do we know if he replied to Lennon's overtures, if you like?
I honestly don't know. I don't know that, to be honest with you, but I know he was aware. He was obviously aware of the Beatles, and they were aware of him. So, but the fact that John sent him a copy of the White Album and Paul, had geodesic domes in his garden, there's obviously something going on there. But I honestly don't know whether they would have had the time or he would have been interested.
Do you know why John sent it in the first place? Why he sent him a copy?
I honestly don't know that. No, I don't.
Okay, with regards to social commentary then, that moves us quite swiftly on, I think, to Strawberry Fields Forever. There are references in the song that you give in your analysis to quantum science. But as I mentioned earlier, and as you, I think, mentioned also earlier in passing, you dive in this song, you dive into elements of social commentary within the lyrics of this song. Yeah. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well,
if you fancy it,
because parts of it are a nonsense. Some of the lyrics are a bit nonsensical, and don't quite make sense. But he's done that on purpose, being interested in this avant-garde sort of post-structuralist French idea of what language and literature is about. The difference between classic, neoclassical theories of literature and romantic theories of literature, where you can say where it's very personal to Lennon because he talks about himself a lot, whereas Paul McCartney tends to write story songs about other people, and Lennon writes songs about himself a lot. And the idea that you can say whatever you want in a way, and people can interpret it in whatever way they want, like they did with "I Am the Walrus." So. I am he as you are me as we are all together. Obviously, that's the quantum aspect of that, but it's also about, left-wing French aspects of relativism, cultural relativism, where you can say what you want and people will take it in whichever way they want. And Lennon was well aware of that, without a doubt. And obviously the nothing is real thing as well, and Lennon used to go into Strawberry Fields as a kid, and obviously his imagination used to run wild while he was there, because parts of Liverpool where they lived then were quite rural. And funnily enough, Woolton Village, where Lennon lived and where McCartney was passing through because he lived not far away from there, it's the most, I'd say, English part of Liverpool. I go there a lot because there's lots of pubs and bars and restaurants down there. It's quite bohemian. And of course, that sort of atmosphere gives you an opportunity to think about things other than the hard-nosed, sarcastic, funny, witty, rough parts of Liverpool, So that contrast is there,
Yeah, and John used to play as a child at Strawberry Fields, which back then was an orphanage, wasn't it? It was Strawberry Fields
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
village, yeah, or Strawberry Field, I think it was called actually, not Strawberry
Yeah,
Fields.
Strawberry Field. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know if you ever go down to Liverpool or you go to Woolton and have a bite to eat and a drink. It's lovely, you know.
I
It's
will
really
do.
nice. It still is now.
Um,
And not far away is Lark Lane. It's just very bohemian, you know. People think Liverpool's just a rough place, but the amount of money coming into Liverpool in the 1840s and 50s, it was crazy. In fact, there was more wealth coming through the port of Liverpool than there was coming through London at that time. And if you look on the outskirts of Liverpool, there are lots of merchant houses where Lennon lived, and just absolutely, they're beautiful, you know, absolutely beautiful. Avenues and boulevards, you know. And it's funny, you know, because the French thing, because even though they went to Hamburg, the influence of their friends in Hamburg, their German friends, Astrid Kircher and Jürgen Vollmer and people like that, were French. The influence was French because, again, it was about this left wing, left bank French thing. And funny, the interconnections, the quantum interconnections, there's so many coincidences. Alan Sittner, when he opened the cavern, it was based on the Caveau de la Huchette, which is based in the left bank in Paris. So he based the Cavern Club on this left wing, slightly odd jazz club in Paris, which is still going today. That's what he based it upon. And there are lots of coincidences like that, you know. I mean, without talking about what's going on in the Middle East today, you know, Jewish culture is very, it's very complex and very sophisticated, and were lots of great Jewish people. I'm not talking about Zionism or anything like that. Just Jewish people who supported the Beatles right throughout the career. You know,
yeah, yeah.
there are that many coincidences within the Beatles' career that you think that something quantum was going on, or there was something subtly going on, because there are literally so many coincidences that otherwise would not have popped into existence. And if those coincidences hadn't popped into existence, the Beatles wouldn't have made it, you know.
Another one, you mentioned clubs. You mentioned the French aspect there with Hamburg.
Yeah,
Another one, one of the clubs that the Beatles played at in Hamburg, if I'm not mistaken, was an Indian named club. It was the Indra.
yeah.
Got
The
that
Indra
Indian,
Club, yeah, the
yeah.
first one, yeah.
They
It's
got
very
on to.
strange that, you
They
know,
got
that's
the first,
another
yeah,
coincidence.
yeah. Something that I picked up on with regards to Strawberry Fields. One of your quotes.
Yeah.
I won't quote it, word by word, but you mentioned you sort of explain Strawberry Fields, and compare the line "nothing is real" to the very present dangers today of unregulated AI technologies. I thought that was quite a nice touch in there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why it's relevant today. I mean, to be honest with you, you know, when I was talking about these coincidences, you know, there's the Alan Sittner thing, opening the cabin, and the French connection, and the fact that shortly after that, John and Paul go over to the left bank in Paris, meet Jürgen Vollmer, and get the absolutely revolutionary, as it turned out, beatnik style French bangs, Beatle haircut,
Yeah,
which changed fashion. You know, and another coincidence is that John Lennon, despite his very poor academic results, was recommended by his Quarry Bank headmaster and English tutor, and somehow ended up at the Liverpool Art College, right next door to Paul and George's Liverpool Institute Grammar School, so they could collaborate on a daily basis.
yeah,
How coincidental is that? First manager agent Alan Williams accidentally bumped into Bruno Koschmider of the Indra Kaiserkeller Hamburg clubs in the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London in June 1960, after he and Liverpool club owner Lord Woodbine first travelled to Hamburg in January 1960, where they initially became acquainted with Koschmider, later confirming their eagerness to send Liverpool groups to Hamburg. They just bumped into him. What a coincidence is that? Ringo drumming and recording with the Beatles in Hamburg in 1960 before joining them. On the Saturday, the 15th of October 1960, Alan Williams arranged a recording session for Lou Walters of the Hurricanes at the Hamburg Acoustic Studio, and Lennon, McCartney and Harrison played and sung harmonies on the recording. Pete Best was in town buying drumsticks, so Starr, the Hurricanes drummer, played drums, and the Beatles, with the Beatles for the first time. This was the first time Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Starr recorded together. Of course, the Beatles later recorded with Tony Sheridan through German impresario recording artist Bert Kampfer to Wonderland by Night fame. So there's another. We talked about the influential Jews. There's actually a list here of Jewish people, great Jewish people: Brian Epstein, Alan Klein, publisher Dick James, Help and Hard Day's Night director Richard Lester, Paul's wives Linda and Nancy, Paul's short-term girlfriend Francie Schwartz. Then there were a host of Jewish professionals: lawyer David Jacobs, concert promoter Sidney Bernstein, Ringo Starr engaged the services of David Fishoff, an observant Jew whom the drummer would telephone every Friday afternoon to wish him a good Sabbath. Other significant Jewish individuals involved in their careers included a battery of accountants and legal professionals such as Harry Pinskus, Stephen Maltz, and McCartney's relatives, Lee Eastman and his son, John. I mean, it's just amazing. Another coincidence, Eleanor Rigby. When Jane Asher appeared at the Bristol Old Vic in the mid-60s, Paul went to see her in Bristol. He noticed Rigby's wine office, not only opposite the theatre in Bristol, but also knew that Rigby's head office was in Liverpool. It's still there, over the road from the Cavern. He got the name Rigby from that. And also, Eleanor Rigby's grave in St. Peter's Church in Woolton is there and was there on the day that John and Paul first met. I mean, another coincidence. And finally, the perennial Lennon claim that in their early days, that they'd go from the poppermost to the toppermost, in other words, become famous. Lennon had already been told this by the Czech wizard occultist Bazira in Calderstones Park, opposite where he lived, by Menlove Avenue, when he was 14 years old. This guy came up to him and said, "One day you will be the most famous man in the world." I mean, whether some of these stories are true or not, they were told at the time. And these synchronistic coincidences have all fed into the mania and the songs, and vice versa, as we've seen. You know, this is part of the mania. That's why I'm interested in it. I'm interested in the Beatles as a fan. I had the opportunity to meet Paul McCartney, and I turned it down because I'm not interested in them as people. They need their own privacy. I don't want to meet them. I was interested in them as a phenomenon, I would say.
I'm going to throw some more coincidences at you. Some people might say they're not coincidences, that there's some part of some plan, but I'll leave that there and let the listener decide on that. But you've got Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager. Paul McCartney's first wife was Linda Eastman, but when the Eastman family, Jewish family, came to America, they were known as the Epsteins, and they changed their name to Eastman.
That's right. You're right. Yeah.
And also there's Scarsdale, which I think is in just outside of New York, or in New York.
Oh, right. I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yoko Ono and Linda Eastman both studied in Scarsdale, or both lived in Scarsdale long before they met John and Paul. Yeah. And then there's this thing around the number 9 that John Lennon spoke about. Actually, he says that his life, many of the landmarks in his life, latched onto the number 9. So that would be dates, numbers of houses where he lived. For example, he was born October the 9th. He was shot dead on December the 8th in New York, but in British time, it was December the 9th. So there's that 9 thing again. And he wrote about it in the song Number 9 Dream, which came out in the 70s.
Yeah. Fantastic song.
Yeah. The number 9.
Absolutely. Revolution. I mean, in terms of superposition as well, there are 2 Beatles albums that could definitely be described as superpositional pop artifacts. There's the Beatles White Album, which is the least Beatles-like or Beatlist album, yet somewhat paradoxically giving its eponymous title, supposed to be represent them as a wave-like collective, the group we all know and love. Yet it's definitely an album of discrete, separate, individually created songs, whereas the more collaborative nature of early and later albums is very Beatlist and collaborative. Also, the White Album was the very antithesis of psychedelic English artifice and conceptuality, it being a mixed bag of collection of individually penned songs reflecting the Beatles' own individuality and widening interests and their sense of growing disillusionment with their collective responsibilities to each other, their fans, and the counterculture. The second superpositional album is for the opposite reason. It's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This album initially came to be viewed by many as a collective conceptual whole though erroneously criticised in retrospect by some so-called informed observers for its lack of tacit togetherness. The reason for the initial reaction are clear, as I say in my book, Journey into Beatledom. Sergeant Pepper is a collection of songs, some of which, on their own authors' admissions, had little in common, yet they still seem to hang together well as an overall anthology for their times. Given for me the Beatles' strangely wonderful quantum ability to make something out of nothing, like they had done so often before in this album, they're forging a vision of intergenerational harmony out of perceived dissonance and successfully mixing traditional and radically new discourses. They were able to pull off a coup d'etat of the mind, and one in which not a drop of blood was spilled on the luxuriant red carpet which they laid at the feet of all those who had bought a ticket to their Edwardian theatre of surrealist dreams. However, in the carpet being red, the killing fields of Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos still needed to be confronted and addressed vis-a-vis the song Revolution Number 9, as Lennon in particular eventually began to wake up from his drug-induced narcosis, but not before a splendid time was guaranteed for all Pepper-esque theatre goers, old and young alike. I mean, Woolton Village is very Pepper-esque. If you go to Woolton Village, it reminds me of Sergeant Pepper. It definitely does. When I went there, it reminded me of Pepper.
And it was Strawberry Fields Forever was recorded during the Pepper sessions, as they're sort of now referred to.
Yeah, and Penny Lane.
Yeah, and Penny Lane. So that kind of ties into all of that as well. That sort of, and
it does, yeah.
Nothing is real, nothing to get hung about, as John sings in the song. I can't help but think what he might have been saying, and this is just my interpretation or my guess or my feeling, is what he's saying basically is that what we perceive in life to be real worries or fears or concerns, perhaps brought about, or in particular brought about by the TV news and so-called current affairs, that's all a trick, a deception, a lie, a smokescreen. So basically, we in this world, we're being had, we're being fooled, we're being lied to. But at the same time, the people that are pushing this lie, this deception, they're laughing at us as well behind our backs, because we're falling for this trickery. Now, I come from a Greek Cypriot background. I was born in England.
I thought you did with your name. I've been to Cyprus. Yeah, it's great.
It's been a long time since I went. But my parents are from there, and they moved to England in the 50s. My Greek isn't brilliant. I can speak it, but I'm not very fluent. But there's this phrase that I've heard over the years since a child. It's a sarcastic line, quite Liverpudlian in its mannerism. Actually, it's got that kind of sarcasm to it, that sort of cheekiness, but with a touch of cynicism in there. And it's the phrase is "beri bezulmas." Basically, what Beri Bezulmas means is said in an offhand way by Greeks, but it's got a kind of a cut to it as well. Basically, Beri Bezulmas, this is how I would see the line or perceive the line, nothing is real, as I perceive it, as I've just explained it. That to me is what John is saying. He's saying Beri Bezulmas. Basically, what Beri Bezulmas is, it's saying that members of officialdom are lying to us, laughing at us. That's basically what Beri Bezulmas means. It's a Greek way of saying they're taking you for a ride, and not only are they taking you for a ride, but they're laughing at you, and they're taking you for a ride with something that's not real.
What I would say is Lennon turned around and said, because he got to know some of these people because of his own influence on Western culture, he said that he thought the elites were mad, He said, if you knew what they were up to, you'd realise how mad they are. And I think that's highly relevant today. Highly relevant. I mean, it's this idea of the gestalt as well, isn't it? Because the gestalt, in a way, is a visual trick. When you're looking at a visual.
That, actually, that's one of the things I'd like to ask you. You mentioned that quite a lot in your book. Gestalt, also galemic. Could you get into some of that? What you mean there?
Yeah, I mean the galemic thing is a metaphor because it's Jewish, isn't it? I'll get that out of the way. The galemic thing is Brian Epstein was trying to mold them. There was absolutely no doubt that Lennon comes from the Calderstones area of Liverpool, which is sandstone area. There was lots of quarrying. That's where the quarrymen come from. The idea of the quarrymen.
Yeah.
I use it as a metaphor to say that Brian he molded them into this galemic monster. This foursome that it's a clay monster, isn't it? And the galemic mud of the lair pool of the Calderstone's mud it's just a metaphor. But in terms of the gestalt, that is slightly different. I mean, many other influential Jewish people helped them along the way. So there's the Hebraic molding in terms of the Hebraic perceptual epithet, the gestalt golem. And as I said, it's metaphorical. And Woolton Village, where the quarrymen hailed from, is a former sandstone quarry and is near the site of the famous Druidic Calderstone, just over the road from Lennon's Mendip's home, and probably the most English-like, neo-Pipperesque, semi-rural part of Liverpool during Lennon McCartney's childhood. The thing is about the Gestalt is that, the Beatles were definitely the greater than the sum of the parts. I think it's interesting to think of them as a quantum gestalt entity existing in multiple states of perpetual flux at the same time. Like a particle and a wave, they were a band, but also four distinct, strong individuals. Personally, I don't think individual members would have been as successful if they hadn't been as part of the group. Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership was really special, and they pushed each other to new heights. They were always at their best when in a state of competitive, supportive, self-perpetuating flux. George Harrison may not have developed into the songwriter he became if he hadn't been in a band with them, and Ringo would never have had the same success. They were a gestalt phenomenon in that sense, greater than the sum of their parts. And as I say in the title of the book, the fabulosity of the four-square golem will never die. McCartney called them four square. In other words, the four corners of a square that nobody else other than their friends in Liverpool and some of their friends in London when they went there could, sort of infiltrate or knew what was going on. That they needed that to protect themselves from the mania that was surrounding them,
I'm going to throw some quotes at you from your book.
Go on then.
Not loads and loads of them, but here's one.
No, go on.
If you want to comment on it, it's up to you. If you don't, that's great. You mentioned with regards to the Beatles lyrics, you describe it as the potentially subversive Beatlist agenda of truth and beauty. I just wanted to know what you meant by that, because that's what you state. And then...
Okay, well, it's a very Liverpool. I mean, obviously, it's a philosophical thing, isn't it? Because philosophy is about, what is truth, what is beauty, how are they interlinked? When they talk about philosophy, they're always going on about truth and beauty. McCartney was very interested in beauty in many senses, I think, although he was interested in truth as well. And Lennon was interested in the truth, I think. And in terms of its Liverpudlianism, I'd say Liverpool's a quantum city because seen in this light, it's neither one thing or another. Historically, a city of transients, of comings and goings, inbound and outbound, embarkations and disembarkations. I think it was a Liverpool rock journalist, Paul de Noyer, who said that in Liverpool, rage turns into beauty in seconds. If you listen to Liverpool people in pubs, you'll think there's an argument going on, and then a lot of laughter a few seconds later. Because what's happening is they're trying to get at truth and beauty, and sometimes to get at the beauty of things, they have to get at the truth of things, and that might lead to an argument sometimes. But then it all sort of people have a laugh about it afterwards, Yeah,
that's very Greek.
So I think that's going on, Yeah. I took some friends from Scotland into Liverpool from Glasgow, and Glasgow and Liverpool are very similar in many ways. And they were surprised how like Glasgow it was. They said, bloody hell, you're just as passionate and as we are, I mean, Liverpool's very similar. It's a place bound together by its own solidarity, but separated from the rest of England because it's what I call its often recondite contrariness. In this sense, it's a quantum phenomenon with a unique kind of quantum duality. It's almost as if Liverpool exists in a superposition of multiple states, a city that is both part of England and yet separate from it at the same time. And also this thing about the Beatles in Liverpool, there's a lot of people in Liverpool who do not like the Beatles at all.
Yeah.
The reaction in Liverpool to the Beatles is very in and out. This in and out superpositional. As Lennon said in Revolution, don't you know that you count me out in? And it really does sum up the ambivalent way that many Liverpudlians feel about the band. On the one hand, they're a source of pride to the city. On the other hand, some people in Liverpool think that Liverpool is more than just the Beatles. They don't want the city's identity to be defined solely by the band, as it has a rich maritime past. Then there's the slave trade and also football. And that's another superpositional aspect, which I won't go into today at all. I'm a Liverpudlian, but I've got lots of Evertonian friends, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. All right then. Yeah.
There's this contrariness and solidarity are evident in the Beatles' music too. And this duality is reflected in their creative process. For example, the way that Lennon and McCartney's different personalities and songwriting styles complemented and competed with each other. John often wrote about his own feelings, whereas Paul is more of a storyteller, as I've said. The contrast is evident in some of their most famous songs. For example, Strawberry Fields Forever is about John, and The Ballad of John and Yoko is about John and Yoko. Right, Penny Lane is a story. And She's Leaving Home is a story by McCartney. He loved telling stories. McCartney's much more of a private person, I think, than Lennon. He tries to keep people out a little bit. He tells stories about other people, and he's also everyone says that John was the wordsmith, but Paul could be just as much of a wordsmith. I mean, generally speaking, though, in terms of their music. And there are some exceptions to this because they could both copy each other's style. It's said that Lennon's Beatles songs are mainly harmonic. They tend not to go up and down a lot, much key-wise. And McCartney's are mainly melodic with more extensive key changes. Lennon's songs have a tighter harmonic structure, and McCartney's songs tend to focus on memorable melodies. Examples of melodic Macca songs are I Will, a favourite of McCartney's from the White Album, and I Love Her from A Hard Day's Night, a beautiful ballad written in the basement of Jane Ash's parents' home in London, Martha, My Dear, Michelle, P.S. I Love You, Mother Nature's Son, Lennon's harmonic songs, Tomorrow Never Knows, Help, Dear Prudence, I'm Only Sleeping, Good Morning. The contrast is there,
Yeah.
And like I said, culturally, this all reflects the different aspects of Liverpool people who will often tell stories like Alan Williams just to make people laugh. Bob Wool was a stickler for the truth. When Alan went off on one and told little white lies about stories about the Beatles just to impress people and make them laugh, Bob Wool would say to me, "Oh my God, here he goes again. I wish he'd shut up." Sometimes they make up stories to elicit a reaction, something from nothing. That's, something from nothing again. It's a form of superposition. Also, the Beatles' humour followed in the footsteps of the Goons and prepared the way for Monty Python. The Goons' absurdist comedy and the Python's surrealist humour really paved the way for the Beatles' offbeat sense of humour. Songs like I Am the Walrus and Yellow Submarine have a similar sense of the absurd as the Goons' radio shows and Monty Python's Flying Circus. Since Liverpool has been said to be at the crossroads of Anglo-Irish surrealism and absurdism, its location and history have given it a unique perspective that combines the traditions of both England and Ireland. This has resulted in a distinctive sense of humour that blends surrealism and absurdism. It's like the city itself is a melting pot of cultures and influences that have produced something fairly unique, really.
And other story songs by McCartney are Eleanor Rigby, of course, and Maxwell's Silver Hammer.
Yeah.
I've got another quote here from your book I'm going to throw at you. We kind of like, we've already kind of skimmed across this one, but there's another one that sort of caught my fancy. So, and I quote, as a microcosm of the broad-based 60s vibe, both the more mainstream consumerist culture and the later counterculture, the Beatles' undoubted reflection and shaping of all this was only possible because of processes going on in the nano realm of their brainwaves, both receiving and transmitting back the literal oceanic soup of the collective unconscious from their global fan base, much like the internet is able to do today with its soup of the collective unconscious from their global fan base, much like the internet is able to do today with its algorithmic translation of millions of Google search engine inquiries into future behavioral trends.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there's a bit of exaggeration going on there. I don't know. But what I would say is that focus on the Beatles was so intense in the Western world, especially. Every time they opened their mouth, not only was it noticed by the media and by their fan base, but it changed things, So, the way the internet's obviously changed the way we are in our lives tremendously. And I just think, using a comparison as a metaphor, that the Beatles were the internet of their day. Maybe that's a bit of hyperbole, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I really think that every time they said something, either in their songs or to the press or in a press conference, the more popular than Jesus quote being an example of that. It changed. I mean, it went ballistic in America, didn't it? Here, Lennon was right. Who was going to church? Who goes to church in the UK these days?
Yeah.
John wasn't being critical of Christianity. He was being critical of the fact that spirituality was on the way. That's what he was saying. He wasn't boasting that the Beatles were more pop, because he never said they were bigger than Jesus. He said they were more popular than Jesus. He was saying that he was regretful that spirituality seemed to be going down the pan in the UK. And obviously in America, because America's a completely different cultural place, it was taken completely different, because fundamentalist Christians will not allow you to say those things without burning Beatle records. So yeah, I sort of stand by that, even though it is a bit of hyperbole. Yeah.
And with regards to Jesus, religion, Christian orthodoxy, or following Christian religion, it's quite interesting in a way that, to me, that he made that statement in kind of the summer of 66. And if you fast forward just a year into June, July 67, you've got the so-called Summer of Love going on, where LSD has become kind of like this mainstream drug, this street drug, whereas before it wasn't known to the mainstream public. And people were finding God, so they say, through LSD. So a year earlier, there's John Lennon saying that Christianity is kind of dead to the young, and a year later, people are finding God in a different way, so to speak. It's interesting that there's that kind of link by 12 months, if you like, that separation, but a link at the same time. It's kind of like he's opening a new chapter by making that statement. He's opened a new chapter into what will become the Summer of Love. It's just one of those weird things,
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, because they were at the focus of attention, and there's this almost sort of cultural biofeedback going on between them and their fan base and them and the media. They were becoming aware of things slightly before they became more mainstream. And I think, even by the time Sergeant Pepper was written and all the You Need Your Love stuff was coming out, Lennon in particular was starting to voice his opinion that things were starting to turn sour. And of course, by 68, you have the Summer of Love, and then you have the Summer of Blood with political assassinations, the Manson thing, people being killed, people taking Beatles lyrics and turning them into something completely the opposite of what they were meant. And George Harrison in particular getting really upset that his stuff was being, used as well, in a negative, murderous sense. And Lennon's antennae was like, all this idealism and hippieism doesn't seem to last long, because there's a fight back. There's a fight back from the elites and this, and obviously, without being too political about it, and obviously, I'm from Liverpool, so I'm quite left wing. There was definitely a fight back by people with lots of money, and they started throwing money at the markets, and this is before Thatcher, and then you have the 1973 Israeli Egypt war, and the price of oil goes through the roof. And before you know where you are, we're back where we started before the 60s, you know, and things have gone way beyond it now because I think it's not capitalism now. It's gone beyond capitalism. What's happening now, I think it's
corporatism.
It's just you know, you're talking about trillions of dollars being thrown at markets to control. You know, they do say that something like 90% of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the population, and to me that's just horrible. You know, it's just horrible.
Yeah.
There's no need for it because they never ever spend that money. So why do they need it? They need it to control everyone. Like you were saying, Lennon was talking about control. You know, and he's coming out with, you know, give peace a chance and imagine and all that a little bit later on. You know, and he's fully, and so was McCartney. You know, McCartney may not have been quite as outspoken as him, but McCartney was the first one that said that they'd taken LSD when Lennon wanted to keep quiet about it. You know, so Paul's just a bit more savvy than John sometimes, you know. That's my opinion on it.
We've already kind of skimmed over this. I've got another quote here from your book. We've kind of already skimmed over this in passing. And the quote is, "It is fairly obvious to anyone that by now the Beatles' lyrics and albums were literally littered with hidden meanings and hidden knowledge that they meant their fans to find and speculate about." So that kind of goes a little bit against what you said earlier, where, well, doesn't go against it, but what you were saying earlier was John and George were getting a bit miffed because people were reading the lyrics of their songs they were misrepresenting the lyrics. And but here you're saying that there were hidden meanings and kind of occult meanings, if you like, in the songs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hidden meanings, yeah. Hidden. Yeah, because people think occult's about witchcraft when, as you know, it's about just hidden stuff. What I would say is it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Once you start playing that game and it's out in the public domain and you can't control it because of the mania, you know, I think what they were doing, they were playing the game and then they regretted playing the game. That's what I'd say.
What do you think the game was with regards to the lyrics? And
I think they were fascinated by the fact that they seemed to have so much influence and they had so much fame, and it can send you, especially if you're taking drugs as well, it can send you a little bit doolally, can't it? And the thing is, you know, John Lennon turns up the studio one day and says that he's Jesus Christ to the others, you know, and they're thinking, hang on, what's going on here? You know, why are you saying that? And he did have this complex, didn't he? This Messiah complex at that point. And then he goes up on the roof of Abbey Road Studios and he's tripping, and Paul and George Martin didn't know what was going on. Paul had to go up and say, hang on, you know, come down off the roof. You know, it's potentially dangerous doing that. Taking LSD and going on the roof of Abbey Road Studios is not a good idea. And George soon cottoned on and said, you know, I've looked at LSD in a microscope and I don't really want to put any of that stuff in my brain again. And the problem is, even when they were in Hamburg, you know, Paul was the most cautious in terms of his drug taking. Pete Best didn't take any at all. George would take a few. John Lennon was stuffing his mouth with uppers, you know, with slimming pills. He brought some home to Bob Waller was telling me he brought some home to Liverpool, and they were in the Black Rose Club in Toxteth, where all the strip joints and Caribbean clubs were, illegal dens, and they were open all night. This is in the early 60s. And Bob Waller turned round to John and said, are you travelling by tube tonight, John? And John knew what that meant, because the Benzedrine slimming tablets came in a little Preladine, came in a little tube. And when Bob Waller went to the toilet and came back, Lennon had spiked his drink with lots of these, and he didn't know, and he drank it. And the next thing you know, he said he was fully wired and he didn't know what he was doing. This is Bob Waller. So, you know, the Beatles were into drugs in Hamburg, you know, so they weren't innocents. And it said that, was it Al Aronowitz? He was an advisor or supporter or agent was helping Bob Dylan, and he introduced the Beatles to weed. but they'd already, I think,
Yeah.
come across it in London one time. They were down in London, a recording. I think it was at Decca. I might be wrong, but I think they were going down to Decca before they got the EMI contract, Polyphone contract, and some guy came out of a van and started offering them weed, in
Yeah.
London in the early 60s. So they were well aware of what was going on, They were well aware,
And another song, which has got, and I think McCartney has said this in more recent years, it has allusions to LSD, to acid, is Magical Mystery Tour, the song, which
Yeah.
sounds very innocent when you hear it. It's like a very sort of plucky
Yeah.
pop song. But if you listen to the lyrics, and it's only when McCartney said, actually, there's LSD references in it, it's only then that I realized, oh, yeah, we're going to take you on a magical mystery trip. We're going to take you on a trip, and then you look at the bus, the Magical Mystery Tour bus in the film, and it's all psychedelic colors, which has references to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Kesey, of course, who was this guy who was this writer of the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, handing out LSD to the uninitiated. So so there's one song where they were hidden meanings, if you like.
Yeah, and of course, even though Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was a painting by one of John's son's friends, they weren't daft. They knew as soon as that went out, you know what I mean? That,
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And if you see the film Magically Mystery Tour, they were definitely on something when they filmed that. It's funny as well, because you were talking about, people interpreting things in different ways, and the way John and George and possibly Paul were saying, oh, well, we don't want people to interpret our songs this way or that, and then they get involved in the game of doing that. I think some of these Beatles conspiracy theorists who think that John and Paul didn't write the songs or Ringo didn't play on the drums, they're doing the same thing, They do, but what they're doing is they're picking up on stuff that isn't true. But it seems as if it might be true, and that's the thing, if you and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying absolutely everything in my book is 100% true. I think most of it is, but what I would say is that it was said or done at the time, and it fed into the mania, and as a fan, I was more interested in the mania. And I was fascinated by how people reacted to them rather than them themselves, because, to be honest, that's another thing. They're just four guys from Liverpool, that like to pint and like to go out and sleep with women. Let's be honest, that's what pop stars at the time wanted to do. They wanted to go out and be famous and be loved and have lots of sex,
Well, with regards to I Am the Walrus, there's some aspects, one or two aspects of it that you've mentioned in the book that I've picked up on myself. And one of those is the line, Stupid Bloody Tuesday. And you mention in your book, with regards to I Am the Walrus, that line, Stupid Bloody Tuesday, written by John, that John was actually shot dead in 1980 on a Tuesday. And you say, and to quote you here from the book with regards to I Am the Walrus and that line, you say, John Lennon was a seer and visionary, perhaps against his own better judgment, and he could not help reveal his own sealed fate. His slaughter was not only senseless and stupid, but certainly bloody. Why out of the blue random reference to Tuesday of all days, you say in the book? Yeah.
I mean, again, it's a bit of hyperbole, a bit of speculation. What I would say is John Lennon said, now, I don't know whether this is true, that when he was a kid, he could see himself floating on the ceiling. And just over the road are the Calderstones from where he lived. And he said he would commune with these spirits. Now, whether that's hyperbole or whether he's just making things up, I do not know. But I actually spoke to a close personal friend of John Lennon, from Liverpool.
And these are ancient stones, aren't they? These cold stones.
Who said that he went to Quarrybank with John. Liverpool Ken, he's passed away now. He was a poet in Worcestershire. When I used to go down to Worcestershire with my wife, I bumped into this guy, and I actually play, because I used to play guitar and sing. I actually appeared on stage with a couple of bands, and he was in the audience, and I spoke to him afterwards, and he said to me, I went to school with John Lennon, and he told me some fantastic stories about how weirdly wonderful and creative Lennon was as a teenager. Lennon would go out of a lunchtime to nick stuff, but he went to Woolworths, where his wife Cynthia actually worked later on, and he would go into the shop in Woolworths and Allerton Road, just by Penny Lane actually, and he'd say to the Woolworths assistants in a mock French accent, he'd see the weighing machines, when people would stand to get themselves weighed.
Yeah.
And he'd turn around and he'd say, "Excuse me, madame," in a French mock, your clock, it is showing the wrong time. It is in Paris now, it is 1 o'clock. It is, and they'd say, "What are you going on about, mate? It is showing the wrong time. You need to change it." And they'd tell him to get lost. And then he went in another day. And in Woolworths in those days, there were cabinets, and the cabinets were glass cabinets full of stuff. And in one cabinet was a cricket ball, stumps, and a bat. And he turned around to one of the assistants more and said, "Excuse me, can I have a pound of cricket balls? And can you boil them first and peel them?" And they said to him, what are you going on about? And he was testing the bounds of reality with people and seeing how they reacted to these strange requests of his. Yeah, this is in when he was at school. He was always doing things like that. He was very strange. And of course, he had lots of cartoons. In fact, that's how he got into art college, because his English teacher saw these cartoons that were sending up the staff, and they were so ridiculously weird, but also funny, that even though he'd done really badly in his O-level exams, the teacher said to the headmaster, "You've got to do something with this guy, because he's obviously very clever," and got him into art college that way. So John was, Lennon was a very complex character, and without him, you don't have any Beatles, do you? You've got to have him starting it off, and obviously without Paul, you don't have any Beatles, and without George, I'll be honest with you, George's guitar licks and little, his middle eights in the middle of Beatles songs, which he didn't get any credit for, they made some of those songs. And Ringo's very deft drumming, he was a left-handed drummer that drummed right-handed, and he didn't take over the song. It was very subtle what he did. He knew exactly what he needed to do to make the song better. And he was, and he doesn't get the credit he deserves. And that's why I call them the four-square golem. It took the four of them. That's what's gestalt about it. Without the four of them, you've got nothing really. You need the four of them. That's just my opinion on it, but it's based on many years listening to them and reading about them and stuff. So there you go.
Do you think that John, Paul, George, and or Ringo, when in their pre-fame years, when they were teenagers in Liverpool, do you think they had some knowledge of the occult or esotericism? Because Liverpool is quite an occult place. It's got these ancient stones. You mentioned the Calder stones and all these stories of hauntings and ghosts, and you mentioned, I don't know, have you heard anything from anybody, for example, that hung around with the Beatles back in those days, that they were interested in esoterica at all?
I think John and Paul were always interested in what I'd call hidden knowledge. They were also interested in finding out weird things, the way they had their own language, the Beatles, the way they spoke to each other, and the little in-jokes, like a lot of teenagers do, but they were very clever with it. A lot of the people who went to the cavern said all the other Liverpool bands went on stage, did their act, wore suits or whatever, and then buggered off. Whereas the Beatles, when the lights went down because of the water coming from the ceiling, the Beatles would go into goon mode and start talking in strange Lancashire accents, what we call woolly back accents, and saying, "Hey, trouble up, my lad," and stuff like that. And how are they doing today? And taking people off the telly, people who were on the telly in what we now call soap operas or comedy programs. And they'd go into comic mode. And some people said, although the music was great, their comedy routines were even better. And that's why they were different. And it's this use of language and this interested in unusual aspects of comedy and philosophy and culture that sort of made them different from the other Liverpool bands. I mean, Spencer, I was in a film with Spencer Lee. It's called The Beatles Liverpool. And he asked me, he said, what other Liverpool bands do you like? And I said, well, not many. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I like the Searchers. I like the clangorous guitars, I said, and I like a couple of Jerry and the Pacemakers numbers. But other than that, I'm not talking about the later bands in the 70s and 80s. I said, other than that, not many, because the Beatles were completely different from everyone else. And that's what sort of attracted me to them. They were highly literate guys, and George Harrison was a moody, George Harrison was interested in money, and then he's interested in spirituality,
Yeah.
It's he's crazy.
Weird. Yeah, very strange. Juxtaposition.
Yeah, because if you got on the wrong side of George, apparently he'd nut you.
Yeah. There is this weird contradiction, isn't there, between the spiritual side of George and then you've got this other side where he was sniffing coke and sleeping around with women when he was married. And thinking about
it's very in and out, isn't it? And the idea that can you change the world through love, or sometimes you have to punish people who are doing things which are evil, and that's a religious, spiritual thing, and that's why they're still relevant for me. It's not just I love the songs. They are still relevant, without a doubt. You couldn't get a band like them today. I mean, people are going on about Taylor Swift now, but Taylor Swift is not going to change the world, is she? Let's be honest.
Not in the way that the Beatles continue to. No.
She might change it in terms of fashion a bit and stuff.
Yeah.
But, because of the internet and because of the way music is now, it's so fragmented. You can't have that amount of influence anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think music stars have got that kind of influence anymore. I don't think they have. I don't think anyone cares, to be honest. I really don't.
No, I don't know. People don't care, unfortunately.
No,
I mean, no. Whereas you do and I do.
Yeah. The reason I mentioned I Am the Walrus, I did mention that there were one or two aspects that I picked up on from reading your analysis of the lyrics. And I kind of went into a little bit of that earlier when I mentioned Stupid Bloody Tuesday, where it seems as though John is kind of envisioning his death in later decades. I was just wondering whether you'd ever read or heard of the book The Lennon Prophecy.
Yeah, I have. I've not read it though. In fact, I've got it on Kindle now.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet, because I have to admit I haven't read it either. I just know but the basic idea of it is that basically John Lennon sold his soul for fame and fortune, and ultimately paid for that in 1980 with his shooting. And what the book I think is putting forward is the theory that the Beatles and Lennon, whether consciously or unconsciously, prophesized his coming demise in the titles of Beatles albums, for example, like Revolver in 1966, and also in photos of the band as well. There's one particular photo from the 1967 film Magical Mystery Tour. There's a scene right at the beginning of the film, and there's a photo of it that you can find online, and it's John Lennon basically with a false moustache on, I think, standing behind a shop counter, and there's a sign next to him, but you can only see a part of the sign. You don't see the whole thing. The part that you see reads, "The best way to go is M&D," and then the next word, you only get the letter C from the next word, but you don't see the rest of the sign because the photograph is cropped. Now, in full, but not in our view, the sign actually reads, "The best way to go is M&D coaches." But because all we see is the best way to go is M, D, and C, it's said that this is another prophetic message alluding to John Lennon's future death, i.e., the best way to go is MDC, as in Mark David Chapman, the man who was jailed for Lennon.
Yeah, well, if it's cropped, I mean, again, it's this Gestalt thing. If you only see part of it, or you can take it whichever way you want. I mean, have you heard of the Liverpool writer Tom Slemen?
I have, yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, and his ghost stories. I mean, in his book, there's the hoary old tale of a young, hopeless musician who sold his soul to the devil on the bridge of Rose Lane. According to the story, in December 1960, John Lennon, aged 20, having heard the weird tale of the Devil's Bridge, became obsessed with the idea of selling his soul to Beelzebub in return for fame and fortune. It was his desire to become a bigger music idol than Elvis Presley, who had ironically been accused of being in league with the devil and playing the devil's music, rock and roll. Now, that story's told. Tom Slemon also says other things about the Beatles. He tells the story about Bazira, which is quite weird because the guy Bazira was was a Jewish occultist from Prague, in the Jewish quarter of Prague, and the idea of the golem comes from the same. Well, Thomas Mayrink, who wrote a book called Der Golem in 1915. He actually comes from the Jewish quarter of Prague as well. So there's another little coincidence. Because
you mentioned that in
the
book,
story
don't you?
that Tom Slemon tells.
Yeah.
In the story, Tom Slemon says that Lennon was playing cricket in Calderstones Park, near to the Calderstones. And the reason why Bazira had come to Liverpool was to analyse the Stones and find out what they were about. And it sent him a bit crazy. He was also a member, and I think this is true in Allerton, which is just down the road, of a witches' coven, this guy. But he fell out with the other members of the coven because they disagreed with his interpretation of the Calderstones. And he met John Lennon as a 14-year-old, and they touched hands, or something similar, something to do with a cricket ball and a train. Well, I'm not quite sure whether I did, even though I've related that, whether that's true or not. But he did say to Lennon, one day you'll become the most famous man in the world. Now, again, see, whether that is true or not, these stories are so much part of the mania. It's fascinating, isn't it? It's fascinating. And again, you know, Lemon's doing what Lennon, Harrison, and to a lesser extent McCartney were doing. They're playing devil's advocate with the readership of the fan base. So it is fascinating, and whether it's true or not, I don't know. I suspect it's not true myself, but there you go.
It's absolutely fascinating, you know, because maybe that's a sweeping statement. I was going to say most people, but that's the way I perceive it. But most people who look at the Beatles from an occult perspective tend to concentrate on looking at the Beatles from 1966, 67 onwards, by which time they'd been in London and they were mixing with the so-called intellectuals that you mentioned earlier from the Indica, Barry Miles and so on, who turned them on to the occult and esotericism. But I'm really interested in looking at their pre-fame years when they were teenagers, their days in Liverpool primarily, but also Hamburg, where you do see these stories that you just mentioned, whether they're true or not. And as you mentioned, the Calder stones, which are these ancient stones that the Beatles were very connected to because they lived near them. I wrote an article many years ago for my site, The Occult Beatles, and it was actually the very first article on the website, and it's called In the Beginning. And it looks at some of these links. Tom Slemons is mentioned, this writer of ghost stories and ghost histories is mentioned in the article with regards to Liverpool, the various hauntings and these stories of ancient stones and so on. I don't have the article next to me, but I do seem to recall that it was either John or Paul. I think it might have been John, but don't quote me on that. They lived, as well as the Calder stones, they lived across the road from a road which was called Druid Lane, I think it was, or Druid Road.
There's Druidsville Road. Fully enough, I was just going to mention that. On the road where Strawberry Field is, a little bit further down is Druids Cross Road.
Yeah.
Druids Cross Road, And the Calder stones are initially, before they were broken up in, I think it was in Victorian times, and then moved, were actually in a circle on that corner, and it's a few hundred yards from Menlove Avenue. But John Lennon from where John lived, Mendips. But you know, John went past that every day. He went past that every day. It's the opposite way to Wootton Village. You got Wootton Village one way, and then you walk in towards Penny Lane, and Liverpool City. Well, it's miles away from Liverpool City Centre, but you're walking towards Penny Lane and towards Liverpool as a city down the other way, and it's just over the road from where John's mother was killed.
And there's I
when she was
feature a
knocked
quote
over.
in the article with regards to the Calderstones that there are druidic. Some experts have linked those stones to the Druids.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
do have connections to that, and there's also the underground tunnels as well. There's loads of tunnels,
yeah.
isn't there? In
There are, yeah,
Liverpool?
yeah, yeah.
Loads and loads
There's
of
loads of
tunnels.
underground tunnels just outside Liverpool City Centre. I've
Yeah,
been to them. At Edge, there's an old Liverpool saying that if you don't want to make a woman pregnant, you get off at Edge Hill,
right.
which is the station
Yeah.
before Lime Street. So it's just an old Liverpool thing. And by Edge Hill, there's tunnels everywhere. There's just everywhere
So
underground.
I find that fascinating, even more fascinating perhaps than the later Beatles history. Looking back at those years and
Yeah,
thinking, the Beatles and all this esoterica that they were surrounded by.
yeah.
It just makes me wonder what was going on. And then you look at some of their songs. You've got elements of sun worship. If you want to go quite esoteric, you could say the Beatles. Okay, it's spelled Beat, but it
Yeah.
could be Beatles as in the insect, which to the
Yeah.
ancient Egyptians was
Yeah.
a venerated figure, the scarab
The dung
beetle,
beetles, the
the dung
scarab beetles or
beetle.
the
Yeah.
dung beetles. There's a
So
book, isn't there, about the dung beetles and beetles. And there's absolutely no doubt, that the Beatles had spent a lot of time underground in dark clubs, you know what I mean? Where, I say they what they metaphorically did was turned it's shit into Shinola, what they were doing was, they were taking all these different aspects which didn't really mean much, and they were turning it into something meaningful, And the thing is with them, that they could take things seriously and then have a laugh about it afterwards and not take it seriously. You know
yeah,
what I mean? And I think in some ways, as young and a lot of teenagers do that, don't they? They'll get into stuff and they'll think it's serious, and then afterwards they'll have a laugh about it. And I think that's what they were doing. I don't think they were consciously being cultic in that sense, but they, like a lot of people, like interested in what we call hidden knowledge, or interested in the idea that there's something going on behind the scenes, and there's definitely something going on behind the scenes these days, without a doubt, and possibly there always was.
yeah. I think so.
But the thing is, if we don't know what it is because it's going on, it's hidden, then how do we know whether it's actually going on or not? There's that double-edged sword about it, isn't it? It's like, okay, if it's hidden, then bringing it into the light of day, do we know that that's actually what's going on, or are we just speculating?
Yeah. I love it. I just love it because
Yeah,
when you
yeah,
think of the Beatles, if you think of it as a venerated ancient Egyptian sun symbol, which it was,
yeah.
what happened after the Beatles when they split? Paul went and formed Wings, so you could say he was a
Wings, yeah,
winged beetle, which is also
yeah,
referred to by Crowley in his book of poetry. I think
yeah,
it might have even been the title of one of his books, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah,
But it's just all these weird
yeah,
things,
yeah.
it just,
There's a video called The Winged Beetle on YouTube,
yeah,
isn't there, which
yeah,
goes into all that. What I was going to say, Arthur Dooley, the sculptor, I mean, he's put a pseudo-religious statue of the Beatles in Matthew Street, and Paul's and John's there, as a cherub.
yeah,
But Paul's, and the idea of the cherub, the angelic cherub, flying away, and Paul, forming wings,
yeah,
because I called Paul in the book the cherub, the arch cherub, and he was quite arch, Paul, because he was always looking to make the Beatles famous, whereas John Lennon was too lazy to be bothered with that sometimes. He just wanted to do what he wanted to do, and if they became famous, great, and if they didn't, he wasn't going to work. He'd just become a layabout, I suppose, a very intellectual layabout. Whereas Paul was always looking for, writing away to people, to TV and radio, saying, we want to become famous and we're great and this, that, and the other. Because he was a great publicist for the Beatles, Paul. That's because he was very charming and he was clever. Whereas John would be nice one minute and then say, "Oh, I can't be bothered with all this. Just bugger off and leave me alone."
Yeah.
So, and George Harrison was a bit like that. George was the first one who wanted to leave the Beatles. Don't bother me. 1963. There's absolutely no doubt that George Harrison was a moody bugger, and he didn't like certain aspects of the fame at all from an early time. He didn't like people bothering him and coming up for autographs and that. He got fed up with it pretty quickly on. And when he was asked before he died what he would like to be remembered for, he said, "I'd like to be remembered as a famous gardener." And they said, "But you were in the Beatles. Why'd you say that?" He said, "Well, I was only in them for a few years, and really that's not me. I'm into gardening and nature and spirituality, and that's what I'd like to be remembered by."
And Formula One. He was into his
Formula One,
well.
yeah. He liked, because his dad was rode buses and they were into cars, and he was into cars from an early age,
Yeah.
Whereas John Lennon drove cars and couldn't even see properly.
And with regards to Quantums, I was just going to say that George Harrison, one of the songs that I wanted to big up is "Within You, Without You," a George song from
without a doubt,
Sgt. Pepper album.
That is
without such a quantum song, isn't it? So
it is a quantum song. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a great song. It's great as well. I mean, for me, see, that's another thing. Everyone, younger Beatle fans now go on about Revolver, and I love Revolver, by the way. But for me, the iconic Beatles album, I mean, Hard Day's Night's my favourite album, but other than that, it's got to be Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, simply because of the effect it had on the world, and I write in the book all the different things it's on about it. There's mention of abortion, there's mention of Edwardian theatre. There's so much going on in that album. It's just amazing. It's just absolutely amazing. So many different circuses, Sergiou artifice. The Beatles are actually appearing as another band, and the traditions of artifice in English literature are many, in fact, British culture in some sense is very focused on the idea of artifice, whereas the Americans are very much more realistic. That's why they don't get the jokes that British. That's why Americans don't get our jokes, because they don't see how we are framing them.
Are you?
There's
old
just
enough to remember when Sergeant Pepper came out, actually was released.
Yeah.
The reason I ask is because what happens is when historians or commentators look back at history, especially those who weren't around at the time, they tend to blow things. You get the impression that maybe they're blowing something out of proportion and they're parroting basically what commentators in a previous generation have said. And because these current ones don't know, they just basically parrot and echo what the previous historians have said. And one of those, I've always had the impression, is with regards to Sergeant Pepper. You hear these days it was a landmark album, that it was the soundtrack of the so-called Summer of Love, that it was a groundbreaker, and on and on and on, blah, 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 echo, echo, echo. But from your standpoint, from having been there at the time, was it regarded in that way back then?
It was bigger than that.
Okay.
Kenneth Alsop said it changed Western culture from modernism to postmodernism, and all the relativism that we see today in the culture wars, where you can't open your mouth because someone might take offence at what you say and take it a different way from, which is what we've been talking about for the last hour, really. Yeah. And basically, that's what it did. And also, it was the cover was so different from everything else. Listening to it and looking at the cover was an experience, a subliminal experience, where it was like, wow, what's this? And it was the first time that the lyrics were on the back of the cover. There's so many different styles of music in it. You've got American vaudeville in it. You've got music hall. You've got Victorian or Edwardian or circuses. You've got politics. You've got spirituality. You've got old-fashioned, pre-Beatles music. You've got the idea of a four-square collective with Ringo's "A Little Help from My Friends." There's so much going on. You've got references, as I said, to abortion. You've got the idea of cross-generational consensus in She's Leaving Home, and the idea of the generation gap. So again, there's that contrast, because the parents loved the daughter, but she said that they didn't understand her. There's so much going on in that album, and it was so colourful that it just blew people's minds. I mean, I can't explain how influential it was, because it was mind blowing.
And did the media treat it in that way? Did they treat it in the way that narrators now look back on it and echo?
They did, yeah. It was everywhere. Not just that. The Beatles would only have to say something, and it was the next day. It was on the front. It was on the front pages of newspapers everywhere. And if they said something slightly controversial, it was blown out of all proportion. So I'm not saying it wasn't hyperbole. So even maybe with Sergeant Pepper, it was hyperbole. But the fact is, it doesn't matter whether it was hyperbole or not, because hyperbole has its effect, doesn't it? Because lots of people just go, oh my God, and take it as read. So when Kenneth Allsop says that, I think it's true. But even if it's not true, it had that effect because he said it. The medium is the message, isn't it? The medium is the message. So there you go.
And with regards to ancient Egypt and sun symbolism with the beetle, I've got a list here because you go into this very, very briefly in your book, the sun, the names of songs with regards to the sun. There's quite a few of them. Here Comes the Sun, which we've mentioned. There's also I'll Follow the Sun from their album Beatles for Sale. Good Day Sunshine from Revolver, also Sun King from Abbey Road, and then McCartney post Beatles. There's quite a few. There's Hotter Sun from his first solo album. There's Où est le Soleil, which came out in 1988-89. It was a big club hit apparently in Ibiza, so I understand. The Sun is Shining from the Electric Arguments album. There's Good Times Coming, Feel the Sun from his Press to Play album of 86, 87. See Your Sunshine from Memory Almost Full. And also Sunshine Sometime, which was an outtake from his Ram album from 1970-71. So lots of references to the sun. Yeah.
I'm not a great lover of a lot of their solo stuff. For me, the Beatles is 1960 to 1970, and then obviously a few other things. But that doesn't mean that their influence today, when people look back, isn't massive. I still think their influence is massive, and I think it comes and goes in phases. It sort of quietens down a bit, but then it comes out. And the reason why it perennially comes back is because the themes behind their music and what they say are perennial and will never go away. And today, even this thing about these Muslim terrorists who call themselves the Beatles, it'll never go away, because it's part of being human. This rage, beauty, truth, beauty thing will never go away.
Why do you think have you given it any thought as to why these guys call themselves the Beatles, these so-called Muslim terrorists? What's the thinking behind it? I haven't looked into it in any detail at all, but it's something that's...
I think they just wanted to make an impact on the West, and then the West picked up on it because there were four of them. And I don't think... And they had like Beatley... They looked a little bit like they had Beatley haircuts, I think, as far as I know.
Okay.
I didn't look into. To be honest with you, I try. The older I'm getting, I'm trying to focus on positive stuff, rather than negative stuff, because there's so much negativity going on in the world.
Here's a positive point then. Did you look at that video that I sent you a few days ago? I emailed to you of Alan Williams doing a street tour of Liverpool back in the 90s. There's a point in that video, and it's and again, this could be just Alan Williams, blowing things up out of proportion. Maybe he's not telling the truth. And he's standing outside Percy Street, which was one of the flats where John and his fellow art student friend in the pre-fame days, Stuart Sutcliffe, lived at. They shared a flat, and it was in Percy Street. And and you've got Alan pointing up at the roof. I don't have the actual quote here in front of me, but to kind of paraphrase it, what he's saying is that on the roof of that Percy Street flat, John and Stu used to sunbathe, and apparently John and Stu carved a sun god on the roof.
Oh,
wow. But that's as far as he goes. He says he made a carving of a sun god, to paraphrase him.
Was that Stuart or John?
John and Stuart.
Right, because, I mean, Stuart Sutcliffe obviously is a very talented guy, and Lennon was a wacky way out guy, so that would not surprise me.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you know, but, even though Alan Williams was a heavy drinker, he was also involved in the art scene in Liverpool a lot, and he introduced the Beatles. Beryl Bainbridge, the writer.
It rings a bell, but I'm not completely.
Yeah, she's she's a very famous Liverpool, right? She died, I think, a few years ago, and there were lots in the papers about her. Her husband was in the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra. Austin, I think his name was, and he had parties in his house just down the road from where you're saying, in the L8 Bohemian district of Liverpool. That's on the verge of Toxteth, but not quite in the Toxteth that we know. That's multicultural, and it was full of, and it's near the Faulkner Street flat of Brian Epstein as well. And I've actually stayed in that flat, believe it or not. There were parties going on, and these parties were very cultural and very sophisticated. This is and after gigs at the Philharmonic Hall, all the musicians would go back, and John and Paul were invited to one of these parties. It was John and Paul's sitting there, and he's trying to impress the older women in the group. So he's doing a pseudo impression of a Frenchman, and he's playing what became Michelle, the song Michelle. And he said, "Oh, it didn't work. I didn't get off with anyone." He said, but I was doing my best, and they were involved in that scene from a young age, They were involved in that cultural scene. And the Merseybeat poets lived in the same area. Brian Patton and Adrian Henry and Roger McGough, they all lived round there. And Paul's brother got in with them, the scaffold and all that. So that was all going on. So it doesn't surprise me. And, they might have done it without really knowing, what it was. They might have done this sculpture and just thought, oh, that's great. And to be honest with you, it was like they'd pick up on things and use it and put it in a song or use it as an idea. And especially with Lennon, and then move on to something else. John Lennon's attention span was very short. Once he'd examined something and discovered what it was, he wanted to move on to something else, whereas Paul would slow him down a bit and say, hang on, no, wait a minute. And he'd do the opposite with Paul, because Paul could sometimes be very twee and write lyrics that weren't very good. And John would say, hang on, that's rubbish, that. You need this. So this competition and supportive aspect of them both, it's there. The Beatles were in flux all the time, and especially if that mania is surrounding them when they became famous, they're bound to be in flux, aren't they? Because there was that much coming at them all the time. What were they supposed to do? It's not possible for a human being to be able to deal with all that without, and it probably helped them as well. It probably helped them. But like you say, in their early days, Lennon was a crazy guy and was trying out all these little sort of word games on people. anyway. Yeah, John Lennon was different, And Lennon's peer group when he was younger were younger than him, some of them, because he wasn't bothered about your age as long as you were different. If you're a bit different and a bit radical, he'd take you on board, And McCartney was different, People keep talking. I've heard people criticize McCartney saying, "Oh, he's just a ballad writer." McCartney is a very clever guy who was different, and when him and John realized that they were the only ones that they knew that wrote songs, that's what attracted them to each other, and the fact that Paul was a very good musician. All this rubbish about the Beatles couldn't play their own instruments. I'm sorry, Lennon wasn't a great musician. Harrison was studious and had to practice a lot to become a good musician. McCartney was a natural. He was a natural, and even though he didn't read music, and Ringo was a natural on the drums. He was a natural. And they didn't write music. So, and John said that helped them not being able to read music because they weren't coming from a formal, aspect. That they could be more creative and try things that were a bit different. Because a lot of minor chords in Beatles songs, aren't there?
Yeah,
Lots of minor chords, and that's why musicologists today are so fascinated by them.
So is there anything else as I bring this to a close now? I've taken up so much of your time.
No, that's okay. Right. Okay. Yeah.
I just
to finish off.
Yeah.
Just
go
to
for
finish
it,
off.
you sound like you want to say something. Go for it.
Yeah. Just to finish off, I'd say it's down to personal opinion preferences in the end. I mean, my book is, like I said, a reading. It's an interpretation, like those conspiracy theories. But I do reference there's lots of verifiable facts in the reference section, historical witnesses and sources. I interviewed Bob Wooler in his home over an extended period. He was interested in the truth. A lot of Beatles songs he didn't like. In conclusion, for me, the Beatles are eternal. And that's the reason why I view their songbook as a form of holy writ. And that's what it's in the title, isn't it?
Yeah.
As holy writ. In conclusion, I'd say the Beatles' legacy is far from fading. Their music continues to inspire, offering a timeless message of universal love and peace, which is more relevant today than ever. As I've said many times, their songbook takes us on an exhilarating journey through their own history. The songbook is their history. The Beatles were not just a band, they were a phenomenon, an enigma, and a celestial force that changed the course of music and culture forever. Just to say, the content of this talk today will form the basis of my next book. But that's the end, just like on Abbey Road.
Okay. So as we're at the end, can I ask where people can get this book? Where's the best place to find it?
Right. Well, you can get it online on Amazon. You can get it from Waterstones in Liverpool or elsewhere. But mainly people order it online. You can get it in Kindle. You can get it as a paperback. It's also a hardback, though the hardback version is quite expensive. It is what it is, I think really it's for people who already know about the Beatles. It's not for people who know nothing about the Beatles. It's a niche book in that sense, and it wasn't about making money. It wasn't about that, because you're not going to make that much money anyway. There are over 10,000 books written about the Beatles, by the way. I don't know whether you know that. But it has its place. And Spencer Lee said the reason that I asked you onto the radio to talk about it, because he said I normally promote my own books, not other people's. He said, so you're very privileged to come on my radio show and I'm promoting it. He said the reason why I had it on is because it's different. He said your book is different, and he also said I'm not saying it's any good, by the way, because that's what Spencer Lee was like. And he said, but it is different. And it is different. Your stuff's great. If you ever want to come up to Liverpool for a pint, you're more than welcome.
I just might hold you to that.
There you go. Yeah. All right, mate.
Thank you very much. And
all right, Matt. That was great.
Care.
Thanks so much again. You take care.
No problem. You too. Bye.
Bye now. Bye. Bye.